BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Black Box Ned 88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. The first thing I would like to say is thank you to everybody who has listened to our recent interview with Drew Beeson about his new book regarding D.B. Cooper and the CIA and some great stories about an individual named Ted B. Braden. And that interview is now up, of course. Thank you to everyone who has checked it out so far. And if you haven't heard it yet, feel free to give it a listen here on this channel, Black Box Online Radio. Moving on to today's topic. So, the first thing to say is we have finally reached our final segment, as promised, on Hal Snook, who becomes a prominent suspect in the Zodiac Killer Hoax Theory, as well as the Part 2. As you'll see, this is Part 3 here. Part 2 was all about Hal Snook as a Zodiac Killer suspect. Did he commit the murders in the confirmed cases of Zodiac activity? We explored that subject in Part 2, and the reason why I said that this was going to turn into multiple segments was, number one, Thomas Henry Horan wrote the notes for these uploads, and he sent me loads of stuff that we talked about in Parts 1 and Part 2, and there really is just a lot of things to say. So we looked at Hal Snook in the Zodiac Hoax Theory. We looked at Hal Snook as the Zodiac Killer suspect. What's really going on with all of this here? The first thing to say is, we have 4 confirmed incidents in Zodiac activity: Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, Lake Berryessa, and Presidio Heights. One of the things that we should note is, 3 of these have something very important in common, and going through the Hal Snook narrative, it really seems to be very clear. Lake Berryessa is the different one, yes. Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, and Presidio Heights, these share a unique commonality. Because so many people are like, what? Presidio Heights? There's not a lover's lane. There's no woman present. October 11th, 1969, we saw the murder of Paul Stein. In all the previous incidents in Zodiac activity, Lake Herman Road, a man and a woman are attacked. Well, of course, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. Then we have Blue Rock Springs, a man and a woman are attacked, Arlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau. Lake Berryessa, a man and a woman are attacked, and it's Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard. What is the commonality with Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, and Presidio Heights? They were all hotbeds for criminal activity. There's somewhat of a debate that's been going on about Lake Herman Road. Was that really a lover's lane? I mean, because some of the things that Thomas Horan has brought to light is just that it was a parking lot at the top of a hill. It is the entrance to a water pumping station. And there are a few reasons why he says it wasn't a genuine lover's lane. If you were to drive down one side of the road, the headlamps would go into the cars and you could see what people would be doing. It wouldn't be a practical lover's lane. And another thing to say is that there was this cement and gravel plant that had its workers getting out. And at the time of the murders, there would have been a lot of traffic on the road that would have been able to notice what people were doing in the cars. All right. I would say, whether you say it's a lover's lane or something else, it was a frequent place where drugs were distributed. That's another thing that people have been talking about a lot. I mean, people are dumping drugs there, and it's going to the smaller, low-level drug dealers and delivery men. Drugs and criminal activity. It becomes one of the places that would have been a hotbed for criminal activity, which means that people could be going to this place where drugs are, number one, to buy drugs, number two, interacting with people that buy drugs, because that's the thing with David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. We do not know 100% why they were in that parking lot at Lake Herman Road on December 20th of 1968. I mean, when I was talking to Drew Beeson off the air after our most recent interview, he's like, maybe they just wanted to pick up a little bit of weed. Could be. Perhaps, though, David Faraday also had a dispute with another student at his high school, and he went there simply to have a confrontation with him. We don't necessarily know, but the point is that it was a place where criminal activity took place. Hal Snook would have known about that because Hal Snook was a narcotics officer in Napa County. And the narcotics department, San Francisco, Vallejo, Napa, they all seem very well connected with confidential informants. That's some of the things that have come to light about the Zodiac Killer. The police department's narcotics divisions have multiple confidential informants, and they're very well put together. When you get to Blue Rock Springs, Darlene Ferrin might have even been the confidential informant herself. It's possible. And if you're going to say something like, this would have been a sting operation and she's the CI who's trying to get her ex-husband Jim Phillips Crabtree set up, Jim Phillips Crabtree could have been present at Blue Rock Springs the night she died. Donald Warren Porter, another criminal from San Francisco, could have been present at Blue Rock Springs the night Darlene Ferrin died. Or simply, if you want to look at the possibility of Hal Snook being the Zodiac Killer, he would have known that she would have been there, and he could have betrayed her, double-crossed her, stabbed her in the back, fired the fatal shots that killed Darlene Ferrin and wounded Mike Mageau. No matter which way you look at this, Hal Snook would have had familiarity with Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs. He had the possibility to know that there would be people in a vulnerable place on December 20th of 68 and July 4th of 1969 because of his work with the narcotics divisions. He had the know-how. He knew that they would be there. And also, if other criminals are planning to come by, then they could contaminate the crime scenes. So then there would always be this excuse that there are going to be other fingerprints left behind. There are going to be other fibers left behind, other footprints. There would always be this excuse about why the crime scenes are contaminated or that the evidence isn't going to be handled properly. They're going to find new things. It was done in a rather masterful way. So that's another thing that we can say. Hoax Theory or Hal Snook as a suspect, he had the know-how. What does this mean about Presidio Heights? How is this a hotbed for criminal activity? Taxi cab robberies. And, taxi cabs were robbed throughout the summer in 1969. And then, once again, whether you look at Hal Snook as a suspect or someone who simply knew that would happen, that there were frequent taxi cab robberies in the area, also in effect to show criminal versatility. Hoax Theory or Hal Snook as a suspect, he would have known about the hotbeds of criminal activity, and you could always find some information about it and manipulate the situation to his advantage. Either way, Hal Snook would have had a very precise ability to do that. Lake Berryessa is somewhat different because this time we have the Zodiac Killer using a knife, the Zodiac Killer is wearing a hood, and Hoax Theory or Hal Snook as a suspect. The park ranger, Dennis Land, was Hal Snook's alleged protege. Dennis Land was the first park ranger on the site of the Lake Berryessa stabbing. The second one was William White. And I noticed that Robert Graysmith mentioned William White in his book Zodiac Unmasked before mentioning anything to do with Dennis Land. He talks about the second ranger that was on the site. So the thing that you would want to say about Hal Snook as a Zodiac Killer suspect, you could do this either way once again. Either Dennis Land is distracting other people, creating some type of diversion so that the Zodiac Killer would have more time, Hal Snook as the Zodiac Killer, that is. Or you could say that Dennis Land committed the murders because he was the park ranger and he had the situation set up so it wouldn't be interrupted. Either way. But this would explain a lot of the differences associated with Lake Berryessa compared to that of the other crime scenes. Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, and Presidio Heights, hotbeds of criminal activity where someone is going to be in a vulnerable place and then Hal Snook or someone else could have taken advantage of them and then Hal Snook could have taken credit for it later in the letters. That's possible. But with Lake Berryessa, because Hal Snook has this first-hand connection to Dennis Land, the park ranger, whom Hal Snook met at Napa Valley Junior College, whom he met at his sporting goods store. Hal Snook did many things, running small-town newspapers, owning a sporting goods store. Hal Snook was very involved with all of these things. So the thing that we would want to say about that is really quite clear. It's like he has all of the ability, the know-how, and he has every possibility to put this into action flawlessly. And there's always this type of get-out-of-jail-free card. You could blame it on other criminals in the hotbeds of activity, but at Lake Berryessa, you wouldn't need to. You wouldn't need to. You can have the park ranger cover for you, more or less. That's all it is. When it comes to the possibility of what we read off in the notes about how the first 5 Zodiac letters correspond to dates in Hal Snook's military service, I think that that's a very big coincidence. Very specifically, 25 years to the day, it matches up with events in Hal Snook's World War II service, going back to 1944. For example, we said in the most recent one that his ship was attacked in the Pacific Theater on November 8th of 1944, and the Zodiac letter is mailed on November 8th. The attacks continued on November 9th, so a letter is mailed on November 9th. We have a lot of things that are really matching up, and that is something that we should not ignore, whether you want to look at it at Hoax Theory or Hal Snook as a suspect. Now let's read some of Thomas Henry Horn's notes that he's written for these episodes. Once again, these are the writings of Thomas Henry Horn. Thank you for his contribution, by the way. And he says that even in Hal Snook's big retirement interview with the Napa Register, it drips with disappointment and resentment. He bragged about his involvement in the Linda Kane's murder and said nothing about Cecilia Shepard or the Zodiac. Nothing. Over the course of his life, he was a frequent contributor of snarky letters to the editor of many newspapers, often tinged with casual cruelty or insensitivity. Some of those letters he submitted under his real name, and others under very clever pseudonyms. The Exorcist letter or the Red Phantom letter, if written by Hal Snook, may not have had anything to do with the Zodiac at all. Hal wrote those kinds of letters to newspapers all the time. And when I read that off right there, the thing that stands out to me is that you have somebody who is very opinionated, who is believing that he is above other people, and that he has a lot of things that he wants to share, but he's doing so in somewhat of a I was about to say the word cowardly, somewhat of a cowardly way, but it's not necessarily in a cowardly way. I mean, he's doing about it in a very roundabout way in which people cannot retaliate. This is the way that he is voicing and expressing himself. And when you look at the murders that we said that took place in the hotbeds of criminal activity, 1, 2, and 4, in the confirmed incidents of Zodiac activity, Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, and Presidio Heights, we could just say, some guy's firing some gunshots and running away. And in that sense, that would be somewhat of a cowardly murderer who thinks that they are above everybody else. And they think that they're doing something brilliant, but in all reality, they're just blindsiding a couple teenagers at Lake Herman Road, blindsiding 2 people that are looking to pick up a little marijuana at Blue Rock Springs, as well as perhaps sell a stolen radio or something like that. And then, of course, shooting a taxi driver in a vulnerable place in Presidio Heights. I mean, that really is not extremely sophisticated. What's sophisticated about Presidio Heights is walking away from that without leaving an enormous amount of evidence enough to get caught. And Horn continues here. For years I have held out hope that Hal, since he's no longer around to defend himself, may have had more or less a noble motive in writing the letters, exposing police corruption. And the funny thing is, his journalism buddies, like Pat Stanley and others, were slapped pretty hard for publishing outright fake news. And the thing to say about that is, Horan has then had somewhat of a change of heart because, as what we said in some previous segments, he's denying the family closure, and that would be Hal Snook is denying the family's closure, spreading the image of terror. And that's one of the points, though, that you really just have to see. It's like, you have somebody who may have wanted to be doing his job. There may have been other benefits for Hal Snook to write the Zodiac letters. I mean, working with the narcotics division, there might have been something that he could do to use this to his advantage. But overall, even if he's taking credit for murders that he didn't commit, it sounds like he is definitely doing something for a selfish motivation at the heart and soul of this. Like, you can work for the narcotics division without taking credit for these murders, and I would say, though, that that's a big thing in the Hal Snook theory. All of the motivations have not been clearly laid out. And it really is sad that Hal Snook is not around, because it would be great to hear his input on this. So many of these Zodiac Killer suspects that have passed away, whether it's Sullivan or Gaikowski or even Arthur Lee Allen to this day, although we do have a lot of media of Arthur Lee Allen, but to hear him defend himself in the present day, it would be like, let's hear what they have to say. Let's hear their responses about why they are not the Zodiac Killer. So, some of the things, though, that we got to say. We got to do a little bit of pushback if we're going to talk about Hal Snook as a Zodiac Killer suspect. Yeah, he had means, motive, and opportunity. So did a lot of people. And if you're going to say that there are all these different fingerprints at different crime scenes, his fingerprints wouldn't be on there. One of the ways that we could do this is, if we had any samples of Hal Snook's handwriting, side palm print testing, fingerprint testing, DNA, things of that nature, or unless, like, we had somebody coming forward that would reveal some other pieces of information, perhaps Robert Graysmith, for example. In the Zodiac Killer hoax theory, it is predicted that Robert Graysmith was an active participant in this, and I say predicted because it hasn't yet been confirmed. Even if Graysmith is not an active participant, it's like you could have someone else who was composing the ciphers, and it wouldn't necessarily have to be Robert Graysmith, but it seems like someone other than Hal Snook composed the ciphers. That's the way the theory goes. I can accept it too. I mean, the ciphers are neat. The Zodiac letters are sloppy. Or they have all of the abnormalities that are found in, hand printing and handwriting that tilts to the side and some of the spacing. The ciphers are very neat. So the thing is, Robert Graysmith is still alive at the time of this recording. Perhaps he could weigh in on the subject a little bit more. Also, one last thing to say, we mentioned this on the channel before. If you look at the original pseudonym that Graysmith created for Arthur Lee Allen, he called him what? Robert Hall Starr. As in Robert for Robert Graysmith, Hall for Hal Snook, and Starr as in star sign, meaning Zodiac Killer. That might be something, that might be not. That was one of my observations. But the Hall in Hall Starr could be something that's connected to Hal Snook. That's just a possibility. I mean, I'm not necessarily sure why Graysmith chose the name Robert Hall Starr. But Hal Snook would have had the ability to be familiar with all of these hotbeds of criminal activity, whether it's the drug trade here, meeting with a criminal here, and taxi cab robberies there. Because of his access to law enforcement, and at Lake Berryessa, he would have had more time, and he or Dennis Land would have been able to manipulate the situation in a way in which more time would have been granted. You wouldn't have to sneak up on two people, fire some gunshots, and run away. You could tie them up and stab them, and it's the situation would have been easier to control at Lake Berryessa if Dennis Land, the park ranger, was in on the case. Does that mean that it exactly happened that way? No, not at all. It's also, let's look at another alternative. At Lake Berryessa, Brian and Cecilia were just in a place that was far away from everybody else. If Lake Herman Road is just a parking lot at the top of the hill and the car lamps are going inside, the killer has to fire some gunshots and get away. Blue Rock Springs, same thing. Presidio Heights, same thing. Lake Berryessa is different because the Zodiac Killer, no matter who he was, would have had more time to commit the murder and still get away without being caught. Because of all the other places have access to, they have closer access to public roads, if you'd say. And, I mean, especially if you're going to say that thing about Lake Herman Road has a lot of traffic on the road at that time, and the car lamps have a very clear view of the parking lot. Absolutely, someone has to sneak up and fire some gunshots and get away. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was anyone. I mean, like, it's a very, very general statement. But what we can say is there would have been perfect opportunity for Hal Snook to know all of the ins and outs of these crime scenes. And Mount Diablo could have been the scouting point. First, look at the different areas, or just look through the police information and find out where things are going down and using confidential informants to find out that certain people are going to be in certain places, with the exception of Paul Stein. I mean, certain people being in certain places, Darlene Ferrin and David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen specifically, in the first two incidents. Then the Zodiac hoax, no matter what, takes on a life of its own. That's the thing, though. I've never really accepted the term Zodiac hoax theory. It takes on a life of its own after Blue Rock Springs, and in the hoax theory, you would have Dennis Land committing the murder or Hal Snook committing the murder. It's a real murder with the Zodiac symbol, and the Zodiac symbol is written on the car door. No matter what, Hal Snook would have had a perfect opportunity to be involved with this. He would have had all the know-how, but he would have only done that if he had a team of people working with him. What do you think about any of the claims we've made about Hal Snook as a Zodiac Killer suspect, as well as the architect of the hoax theory? If you have anything to say at all, please drop a comment below. I would love to hear from you, and challenge me on anything. Until next time.